So you moved to Laramie, and what do you do there while your wife's getting her master's?
I was fortunate to get a job. You have to understand Wyoming then, and it actually hasn't changed much, very low population. A former senator from Wyoming once described it as a land of high altitude and low multitude. And true then, true now. And so there weren't a lot of media operations. But there was a television radio combo operation. In other words, in one building they ran a television station and a radio station that actually took news seriously to the degree they could afford to have a news department. They had one, took it very seriously. They were seen over most of the state of Wyoming. And due to a commitment by the really good ownership there, they had a correspondent in the state capital in Cheyenne. And Cheyenne's about 50 miles from Laramie. Laramie being the home of the university, a lot of the stories that got covered were either in Cheyenne or in Laramie. And I learned of this opening and applied for it and was able to get that job. So I became the State House correspondent for KTWO, known universally as K2. So I became the K2 reporter in Cheyenne and would cover stories there and sometimes in Laramie associated with the university, and they would send me to other parts of the state. And because it was small, when frequently when someone was on vacation, I would go up to Casper, which is in the center of the state. Laramie and Cheyenne are down in the lower part of the state. I would go up there and substitute for whoever was on vacation. I would do the sports or the weather or anchor the news or anchor radio newscast or whatever was required.
And who owned the station at that time?
This little company called Harriscope. I think its official headquarters were in Los Angeles, but they owned several stations in the Mountain West, and they owned a station in Chicago, an independent television station in Chicago.
And were you able to stay in Laramie with this job, or did you have to be in the other areas as well?
I continued to live in Laramie. And when the legislature was actually in session, I would stay in Cheyenne. And the rest of the travel was pretty much for, as you would say, breaking news.
So your wife, Janae, gets her master's degree.
Yep.
What happens to you guys then?
Well, we ended up moving to Casper, home of K2, and I became the news director of the station. And Janae, who was still primarily interested in newspaper reporting at that time, became a reporter at the Casper Star Tribune, which was the biggest paper in the state.
Wow.
And did primarily government reporting for them and a lot of human interest features. And a fellow had been hired at the television. There's the fellow who hired me to be in the news department decided he wanted to go into radio sales. Then he hired a fellow to replace him from another market, and he was a very good reporter. Turned out not to be a great manager, so they let him go, and they were looking elsewhere for a replacement, and I called up and said that I would like to apply, and I remember the initial response was, well, you know, you've never been in management, whatever, and I said, well, I have not, but I would appreciate a chance at it, and I put this more diplomatically, but I had already started to look at the newscast, and this was the undoing of my reporting career. I would start to look at the newscast, and I would say, oh, boy, that wasn't very good. That wasn't very good. This is wrong. This whole thing could be a lot better, and I think that those are the primitive stirrings of somebody who might think they could be in management. So when this fellow quit, and I had gotten the impression it probably paid a little bit more too than what I was doing, and money was in short supply, I decided, well, I could do that, and you'd still do those other jobs. You would do some reporting, you'd anchor some, but I said, well, here, I'm ready, and they made the fateful decision to let me become the news director. So then we moved to Casper.
Wow. So your first job in management.
Yep. Now that I think of it, I was 20. That's when I was 24. 24.
And how long were you the news director there and managing the operation?
Let's see, it must have been 3 years-ish, something like that.
So about a 3-year stint.
Yep, something like that.
And then what happened?
We decided it was time to move on, try to climb the ladder, both of us, and I got a job. Those days there was a magazine that served the broadcast industry, and they ran, people were trying to hire, the stations were trying to hire people, had ads in a classified section in the back, and I saw one that needed an executive producer, and I had decided, which is sort of the number 2 job in a television newsroom, and I had decided I wanted to try to climb the management ladder, and I'd consulted with my former professors and some other people I met in the business, and they thought that that would be a good thing for me to try to do, and I saw an ad from WNEM in Saginaw, Michigan, Northeast Michigan, NEM, and I applied for that and got that job and moved to Michigan from Wyoming.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, yeah. That's not a move I would recommend to everybody, because I've been living in this beautiful, clean area full of these independent types, and moved to Michigan, with no disrespect to Michigan, but a very different culture. Certainly not the wide open spaces. It was sort of culture shock, but at the same time, it's good for me. I got to cover an entirely different kind of news. I got to work with entirely different kinds of people, very different management challenges, and I think that was long term was very helpful to me. But not long after I got there, I said, I don't think I want to be a resident of Michigan the rest of my life. No disrespect, but it wasn't quite me.
So how long were you there?
I think I was there maybe 18 months, something like that, and I got a through school contacts, former professor. I learned a former student had just left a job in Roanoke, Virginia, and I applied for that job as news director. So that would be a move up. I applied for that job and went to got selected to be interviewed, and went down there and met a gentleman who was a wonderful legend of Virginia broadcasting, John Harkrader. He was a great guy, and he just having my interview with him was one of the best things in my career. But he called me a couple of weeks later. He said, "Look, you're basically in a dead heat tie with the guy who's already here, and I feel I have to stay with him. And but I have a good opinion of you. I help you. Is there anything I can do for you?" And I said, "Well, it was great meeting you. I certainly understand your reasoning. It was a great experience. And all I would say is, if you run into anybody else looking for somebody, I'm ready to be a news director in a larger market. And if you just mention them to me." And it wasn't, I don't know if it was 2 weeks later, I got a phone call. I won't attempt his great Alabama accent, but a gentleman with this great southern drawl said that he was the general manager of the station in Mobile, Alabama, and he had heard about me from the fellow in Roanoke, and based on what he had heard, that I might be a fit for them, and would I come down and talk to them? And one thing led to the other, and I got that job, thrilled to get it, and ended up moving from Saginaw, Michigan, due south to Mobile, Alabama, and I'm happy to say have never lived in the North again.
Wow.
And finally got to Mobile and worked there I think another 3 years or so. And that was a really good television station, great people, and great ownership. And it's just important. I think viewers know this, but it just, so much of it in broadcasting, I think, has to do with the quality of the people who own and run those stations.
And who owned the Mobile station?
Right. That was owned by a gentleman, a local architect, who'd grown up there, and he got interested in, he'd been very successful, wanted to expand into some other businesses, and he decided to buy that television station when it came up for sale, and bought it, and was able to change the letters are called call letters, and he was able to change the call letters to match his initials. He was Kenneth R. Giddens, and the station became WKRG, and worked for him, and for several years. And he stayed. He would come by and make sure you knew that he was watching and that he was interested in how the station was doing. But he had another fellow who ran it for him, and he actually didn't interfere with the day-to-day management. So, but he was, but if you were in even though I was in lower management, he made sure you knew that he cared about it, and that he wanted the station to stay strong, and he stayed involved enough to make sure that happened.
Were you the number one news station in the market?
We were. I'm happy to say that when I got there, we were not quite number one, but I was able to hire some really good folks, and with a lot of backing from the station management, we became number one.
So you're in Mobile 3 years.
Yep.
Gosh, that's a pretty nice place.
It's a great place.
What made you want to leave?
Well, I had the station was a CBS affiliate, and I had a lot of contact. There were a lot of big stories that happened in Mobile by coincidence at the time when I lived there. Not all of them pleasant, but important stories. Train explosions, hurricanes. That market includes Pensacola, Florida. A pilot got confused one night coming in for a landing in Pensacola and set the plane down in a perfect three-point landing about a mile out at sea. And that was a pretty big news story. Everybody got out. But I, because of all these big stories, and because we were helping our network, CBS, a lot of people came from CBS News to cover these stories, and they would work from our newsroom, and I got to know them very well. And then when there was an opening at CBS News, they urged me to apply for it. And I had thought about trying to work, for the national side at some time in my career. When I was at American University getting my master's, the main professor there had been Edward R. Murrow's editor all those years at CBS News, and he had given me a very strong CBS News orientation. And so when a job came up as the assistant bureau manager in Atlanta, which was in those days CBS's base to cover the Southeast, including North Carolina, I decided to apply for that, and was fortunate to get that job. I replaced a guy named Don Brown there, and I mention that because he became important later on in my career. He was a wonderful guy. I loved working with him over the phone, and he got hired in the way of the weird world of television news. He got hired away by NBC News, opening that spot in Atlanta, and then he asked if I would go to work for him at NBC, but he was now based in Miami. Our son Hugh had just been born, and taking that job meant I would really be in Central America full time, because that's when all the wars were going on in Central America. And part of me really wanted to cover exciting stories like that, but I didn't want to be gone literally all the time when our son was at small. So I decided to take the CBS job, which involved a healthy amount of travel, but it wasn't all the time. I'd still be around to see him grow up. So I took the CBS News job in Atlanta and moved up there in the last days of 1979. And that was a big break in my career. We're out in northwestern Atlanta, and downtown, this crazy guy named Ted Turner had announced that he was going to start a 24-hour news channel called CNN, and my wife Janae decided that might be a good opportunity for her, because she was going to try to find a job, and she had been thinking she would apply maybe to the Atlanta Constitution, which is a fine newspaper, but she decided that would be a good opportunity for her. She applied and got that job, and I honestly can't recall, but she was around the 12th person hired at CNN. And so she got this great opportunity at the same time I did. And we picked up and sold the first house we had ever owned in Mobile, and put all the stuff in a van and drove to Atlanta.
So you move to Atlanta, you get your first job in network television, and your wife goes to work for kind of an unknown startup called CNN.
Yes.
So tell us about your Atlanta experience.
Well, the CBS News Bureau in Atlanta had responsibility for North Carolina, Tennessee, south to Florida, and west to Louisiana. But in real life, we would frequently have to leave that territory to help around the edges, and it was not unusual to need that we would have to send people to Latin America. So it was geographically, it was pretty challenging. A lot of news. Anyone living in North Carolina knows that this state produces a lot of news. There's a lot of news throughout that region at that time, and we really were an organization of travel teams that had to be ready to fire out the door at a moment's notice, usually on chartered airplanes, and a lot of travel. There were some satellite uplinks in those days, but not nearly as many as there are now. And obviously, we didn't really have commercial news gathering use of the internet yet. So a lot of the material had to get back to our central office in Atlanta in order to be transmitted to New York City over lines that were really ordered from the telephone company, but could not be ordered on short notice. So a lot of our work was getting out to a story, getting on a charter plane, coming back to Atlanta, and feeding that news to New York for inclusion in the CBS Evening News, or another time of day in the CBS Morning News.
So what year was this that you started in Atlanta, moved back to Atlanta?
Well,
Atlanta.
I got there literally about Christmas time of 1979, and really started working, got into the office on a full-time basis in probably the first week of January, I would think 1980.
And I think you said something interesting too, is that, while there were some satellite uplinks, a lot of it was still broadcast over telephone wires.
Oh, yeah.
And when you had something you wanted to send, it wasn't like you just did it today like you would do on an internet connection. It's something that had to be ordered, and it was a special line that had to be free of any static or anything. It was quite a process.
Quite a process. In a few major cities or geographically selected cities had one of these kinds of telephone lines permanently installed. I recall we had one in New Orleans, but most places did not. So you had to, in addition to figuring out how to cover the news accurately, you also had the logistical challenge of getting someplace that you could feed it to New York for inclusion in the broadcast. So it was pretty hectic, and on a practical basis, there was no such thing as a day where you were truly off. If you worked there, you were considered fair game every day of the week, and whenever the news happened, you had to go. Now, my job was a little bit more to stay at home and run the operation day to day, so I didn't have quite as much of that, but I did a fair amount of that. And then in addition to that, we obviously had to cover trials and things that were at least scheduled, but were also challenging to do. So.
And an interesting counterpart, your wife is working at a brand new concept, a 24-hour news channel.
Yes, and she had a very challenging job there. Within a few months of starting, she became the first vice president of international news coverage. She was born in Panama. She spent some of her childhood years in Europe and had a very deep interest in international news. And so when she was given the opportunity, she was happy to start to work in that area, and that really was a big break for her. And she helped shape all that early international coverage. And if you go back now, our viewers of a certain age will remember there was a time when a lot of CNN's early reputation was built on international news coverage. So she was under a lot of pressure to come through on those stories, but it was a good thing for her, and she thought it was important for the American audience, and it was a big contributor to the early success at CNN when things were still a little touch and go. And so she was very busy with that, and I was very busy with U.S. news, particularly from the Southeast, and so it was a rollicking few years.
And how long were you at CBS in Atlanta?
Let's see, in April of 1985, I was promoted to a job that was theoretically based in New York, but I worked out an arrangement where I didn't have to move my family. And one of the reasons I did that was that I knew I would be traveling a lot anyway and be seldom in New York. And that job was to try to provide news stories on a daily and hourly basis to the local CBS affiliates around the country. And that's a moment when my career took another turn because, as mentioned earlier, I had worked at several different local television stations. I had an appreciation for the importance of local television and the role that local stations play in supporting their national networks. But it was also important, in the view of many people, including myself, that the national networks support the local station news operations, and they would be kind of in a beneficial, mutually beneficial relationship. And because I had acquired some experience in coverage of major and breaking news from a national perspective, and because I had the local news perspective, in their wisdom, my bosses at CBS News thought I would be the person to take over a small operation that they had going in New York and make it grow and try to make it a better version than the one they had at that moment, so that the relationship between the local stations and the network news division would improve. And so in April of '85, I was called up to headquarters in New York to try to work on that.
Wow. And that was kind of a precursor to another large project that you got involved in.
Well, yeah, it was. I worked at that until just past the election of 1988. And I had, so 3.5 years or so, and I had decided my whole career, I had, to that point, I had really just been involved in news coverage and in the management of news coverage. But that job required me to start to learn a little bit about running a business within CBS News. It was set up in a way as a small business, and I had to learn a little bit about raising revenue, managing expense, and although it was never I never really considered myself a business person. It wasn't my favorite thing. It was a valuable additional kind of experience, a different element to add to things I had been working on, and because I got to basically restart that department, I basically got sort of a burst of entrepreneurship. I had, in a sense, been, I guess what in those days they called an intrapreneur, starting up within the company. But then my wife always said it was my way of having a midlife crisis, but I decided I wanted to quit CBS News and go off on my own as a consultant. So I did do that, and started consulting the news operations of local television stations. And I also started working with some non-television companies who were pursuing ways to use television as a tool of internal communications within their company. I did a project for a large bank in Atlanta. I did a project for, of all things, a carpet company up in Dalton, Georgia. But most of my work was with the local television news operations, and I had to travel, but not as much, believe it or not, as I'd had to travel in either of my CBS News jobs. So it worked a little bit better at home. It gave me a certain kind of experience. Nobody in my family had really had any experience with self-employment, and it was good for me to be on my own and realize that nobody was going to bring in any income for me. I had to go out and handle sales myself. I had to keep control of my costs myself, and and at the age of roughly 40, it was a really good experience for me. And then after some time of doing that, must have been the early in 1989, a fellow I mentioned earlier, Don Brown, who had been my friend at CBS News all those years. Don had gone to work for NBC News, first in Miami, and he'd been promoted, deservedly so, to the number 2 job at NBC News in New York. And his boss was a really good, nationally known and respected journalist, but he came from the newspaper world, and somewhat unusual situation for someone in that position. He didn't really have any television experience, and that gentleman, Michael Gartner, had no experience with dealing with local television stations. And Don, who knew the value of dealing with local television stations, was having difficulty getting his boss to appreciate why it was important. So he called me up and he said, look, as a favor to me, are you still consulting? And I said, yes. And he said, well, look, as a favor to me, would you come up here and just try to get my boss to understand the potential in this relationship between the national part of NBC and the 200 or so local affiliates around the United States, because he doesn't quite get it, and I think it'd be helpful if someone else joined me in trying to get him to understand it. So I went up and had a number of very productive conversations with Don and his boss, Michael, and they asked me if I would be willing to do a project for them to try to figure out how they could improve their relationship with local stations. Let me say that back in those days, NBC had basically done a poor job of covering the San Francisco earthquake, and it brought a lot of bad feelings between local stations and the network to a head, and relationships between NBC News and its local stations around the country were at an all-time low. I should say that most of the local stations for any network are not owned by that company. They're owned by other companies. ABC, CBS, NBC own 10 stations or so. maybe a few more in the very largest cities, but most of the others are owned by other companies. And the other companies don't necessarily have to do what the network says the network wants them to do. So there's a relationship there to be created and managed. And candidly, that had not been done very well by NBC for some time. And the new managers at NBC News had recognized that, and they realized things had to get better, but they weren't quite sure what would make it better. So I was hired to do a study of NBC affiliates and figure out what NBC News could do to make things better. And I wandered around the country and talked to news directors, many of whom I already knew, and also made some new friends and had very candid conversations about what was right and what was wrong. And then I started to, and then I already had experience in that kind of relationship when I was at CBS, and I started to get this notion for a different way to approach that business, that part of the business, and made a recommendation to NBC News that it should start a different kind of, in the television industry, these are called feed services, as in feeding news to the local stations. And I said that that there needed to be a complete change in attitude, and that the stations had to be treated with respect, that the organization had to define itself as a customer service, that it couldn't be, oh, you're lucky that we're here at the almighty network in New York and we're condescending enough to talk to you, that it had to be mutual respect, and that although it doesn't sound like that would necessarily be a brilliantly creative idea, when I was proposing that in roughly 1989, it was a new thought. It was not the practice at any network. And they said, well, could you write up for us a plan to make that happen? And my wife Janae also joined in, because we felt that a part of that plan should include service to international networks who are vital to U.S. news networks in terms of getting news from those other countries. So she also participated, and we wrote up a plan. And the most novel part of it, and probably the biggest gamble, was I suggested that it not be based in New York City, and that it not be based in Washington, the two big traditional television news centers, but instead be based somewhere else. Our friends at CNN had proved that such an operation could be made to work in a place like Atlanta. Technology had developed to the point where the operation really could be just about anywhere. Satellite uplinks would work from just about anywhere, for instance, and that it was time to get an entirely different view. And they decided to act on that. And I thought my work was done as a consultant, and that I had finished my project. And I said, if you ever actually do this, I would be interested in consulting that operation. But I had to make the presentation to the fellow who was at the very top of NBC, not the president of NBC News, but the fellow who was the president of all of NBC. And I just said my one recommendation would be, do not, if you get advice that, okay, we want to do this idea, but we want to do it from New York, I would urge you not to try this particular plan in New York. It would not work in New York. It wouldn't work culturally. The technology that I'm recommending would actually be more readily available out of New York. Costs would be lower out of New York. And the sort of mindset that I'm recommending to you, I don't think is achievable right now in New York City. So I was startled to get a call maybe a week or so after I met with them, and they said, the big boss likes the idea, could you write this up as a plan? And then I did, and that took a couple of months, and I submitted that. And then as a newly self-employed person, I was just hoping it might lead to some other consulting work, but they called and asked if I would come on board and run it. and if Janae would come on board and help NBC News with its international news coverage. And I had left big corporations for a reason. I enjoyed the freedom of being on my own. I was not eager to change my life, but as I thought about it, I realized it's such a rare opportunity when a big company like that, with all those resources and that reputation and that quality of journalism, would come to someone like me and give me a chance to try to do something in the way I wanted to do it, and a plan that an approach I believed in. And I decided, well, I really ought to take them up on it. So somewhat to my I surprised myself, but I sat down and signed up and told them I would do it, and I would join the staff of NBC, and I would make arrangements to transition my clients to other folks who would agree to take them over, and I would try to make this happen. And I guess that was in the I probably made a commitment in the early days of 1990.
This was the birth of the NBC News Channel.
Yes, I suggested that it be called. My original suggestion, I think, to the head of NBC, a fellow named Bob Wright, was that it be called the Affiliate News Channel. And I remember quite specifically at a big meeting at 30 Rockefeller Plaza, the big building you see in all the NBC programs, right above the skating rink there, home of Saturday Night Live and all those shows. He said, look, I see what you're trying to do with that, and you're trying to focus it on basically the customer. He said, and I respect that. He said, but I think that if we're going to do it, we ought to do this right, and it ought to be, it ought to have our name on it, and I want it to be called the NBC News Channel. And and that was good, because that discussion was over. Because the big boss and large companies can sometimes take a decision like that and drag just what to call something out for months. And I was grateful that Mr. Wright had declared that this is the name, and it's something. And the other critical thing that people had heard him say is, I want my name on it because we're going to do it right, and we want to be proud of it, and I want NBC in the name. So it became the NBC News Channel.
How did you select the location?
Well, at that same meeting, Mr. Wright said, well, you have to go figure out where this is going to be. Because I accept your premise that it should not be in New York City. So you go out and figure out where it should be. So I got some assistance from sort of logistical and technical and real estate people working for NBC. They were very helpful in helping me form a little team. And we reviewed all sorts of documents. We traveled around the country and started to look at a place that might make sense. I rejected Atlanta, which would have been easy for me personally because I was living there, because television news is really a cutthroat business. And one of the favorite tricks in television news is to try to hire away the best people from an upstart competitor. So I knew that if we started in Atlanta, that CNN would just monitor us for our best people, and whenever there was an opportunity, it'd be so easy to hire them away. They'd be right there in Atlanta, they wouldn't have to move their family, and that it would be easy to block what we were trying to do in terms of having a quality staff. So I felt it should be someplace else, and then we considered all sorts of places: San Antonio, Salt Lake City, Oklahoma City, Dallas. We considered Orlando, considered Charlotte, and I think those were the ones who were sort of in the final group. But ultimately, I got a phone call from a fellow named John Hayes, who in those days was the general manager of WCNC, the NBC affiliate, in Charlotte, and he said, well, I understand, I've heard what you're up to, have you considered Charlotte? And at that moment I had not, just because it was early in the inquiry and I had not gotten around to Charlotte yet. And he said, well, look, I'd really like you to come up here, talk to me, let me tell you what's going on in Charlotte and North Carolina nowadays and reasons why I think it might make sense. So I flew up to Charlotte, and I knew John from previous experience in the industry, and had a very good conversation with him. And I started to say, you know, Charlotte might really work well for us. The local NBC affiliate was about to build a new building alongside Billy Graham Parkway in Charlotte, just a few miles from the Charlotte airport. It would be, money could be saved by partnering with them, and a separate building could be built for us. And so that was a good element in the mix. It was very close to the airport, and I knew that would be important. In those days, I'm talking about 1990. I don't recall precisely, but I think at that point Charlotte was certainly one of U.S. Air's two biggest hubs, and may have been becoming the biggest one. And you could get anywhere from Charlotte in a hurry, anywhere around the United States, and also more places overseas than people realized. So I liked the transportation aspect of being able to get anywhere in a hurry. Charlotte is, this gets a little technical, Charlotte is far enough east that the right size satellite dishes can receive international satellite signals. Those satellites are parked out over the Atlantic Ocean, and if you get too far west, you can receive them, but you have to build a satellite dish about the size of a football stadium, and it's not practical. So a reasonable sized satellite dish could receive a great variety of satellite signals, and that was important to me. And then there was just the tradition of local television in North Carolina. I was familiar with it from my CBS days, and I knew that there were high quality local television stations in the state. And I thought my chances over time of being able to hire people from those stations would be very good, and that there was a quality tradition of quality broadcasting in the state of North Carolina. Obviously outstanding universities in the Carolinas. And the other thing is I read a lot and studied, and the team from NBC helped me research some statistics, but I had my eye on the fact that in those days there's a lot of publicity to, I think that we called it the I-85 corridor, but there was an economic boom underway, stretching 50 miles or so to either side of I-85, running from roughly Spartanburg, Greenville, South Carolina, up through Charlotte and to Raleigh, and on either side of that highway. And I honestly don't remember the exact statistics, but employment there was, or I'll put it this way, unemployment was lower in that band than the rest of the country. There was a lot of investment in that band. The booming banks in Charlotte, international investment by foreign companies up and down that band. And one thing in the world of television news, people always want to change jobs. And one of the things the other thing I had noticed is that an awful lot of people working in television news, and for all I know, other walks of life, but this is the only one I've ever done, they might be part of a married couple where both husband and wife wanted to work, and lots of times you would lose somebody from your newsroom when they would come in and say, look, I love it here and I want to keep working here, but my wife can't find the right kind of opportunity, and she just found an opportunity, and we're moving to Los Angeles next week, and I have to turn in my resignation, kind of thing. So I said, if I could get the news channel in an economically healthy area that's expanding, and also, I should say, has diversified industry. And that was one of the big changes from the previous history of the Carolinas. There was a lot of diversification in industries along this I-85 corridor. Just statistically, the chances that my future employee's spouse could find a job in his or her industry over time would play out to help me maintain my staff. They'd be less likely to leave. And I wanted the news channel to be a true customer service that didn't just work on computers and wasn't a soulless place. I wanted it to be a place where somebody at the local station in Los Angeles or Chicago or Rapid City, South Dakota, really knew someone by name in Charlotte, North Carolina, in our operation, and had worked with that person for years, and where our person had done favors for them, and they owed us, and they had done favors for us, and we owed them, and that it would be a relationship business that when the chips were down and things were really busy because some huge news story had just happened in, to use a real life example, Oklahoma City, I wanted to know that the person at the NBC affiliate in Oklahoma City would stop and call us and help us get our video, help us get set up there, help us with all those things that are critical to news coverage. But I didn't think it would happen if the people in Charlotte were constantly changing. So I had to do something that would give us continuity of staff. And I said, North Carolina is a great state. It's got great universities. In this section I'm discussing in particular, it had a booming economy. It's a great place to live. Charlotte was specifically a great place to live. And I said, my chances of getting the kind of customer service mentality I want and getting individuals who will come and stick with it are better in a place like this. So these other cities were good, but I decided that Charlotte made the most sense, also close to Washington, also relatively close to New York, so we could get to headquarters when necessary. And so I went to New York and sat down and told the big boss, Bob Wright, head of NBC, that my personal recommendation was Charlotte. And in those days, it's just very interesting how life happens sometimes, and how big decisions get made on factors you couldn't guess in advance. And he listened carefully to all that. And Bob Wright was the smartest guy and the best analyst I ever met, financial analyst of business situations. And in those days, NBC was owned by General Electric. And Bob Wright had been a senior official for other parts of General Electric before he was assigned to NBC. And he said, well, look, he said, I've been to Charlotte a lot. He said, my old job had me in constant contact with all those big banks down there that are growing. I like Charlotte, and it looks to me like it's the right kind of community for a General Electric business. And he said, the other thing is, the top of General Electric in those days was a fellow named Jack Welch, who was a legend in corporate circles. And he said, Jack and I talk about this all the time, and General Electric is putting its customer service-oriented businesses in the southeastern states. We find that the population there is more open to it. They're better at customer service. They take it more seriously. They're friendlier to people. They're open to different methods of organization. And what you're really talking about is the NBC News channel being, in essence, the customer service arm of NBC News. He said that's how someone with a General Electric background would look at it. And I said, well, Mr. Wright, I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's exactly the point. It has to be a customer service, and a good one, or it will fail. And And Bob Wright put his hands down like this, and he said, "Okay, everybody, this is going to Charlotte, North Carolina."
So NBC News Channel is moving to Charlotte. How did you put an organization like that together? What an opportunity for the state of North Carolina to have a network news gathering operation and sending those news stories out to network affiliates all over the country, right in North Carolina. How'd you get started?
Well, I thought that these factors we've mentioned that were sort of technical, logistical, corporate factors would be important to our eventual success. But I thought that no contest, the single most important element would be the quality of the staff. And I knew that I would have to start small and build the organization up over time.
So how many people did you start with?
I think our opening day total was right about 30 on the permanent staff, and we had a number of freelancers. Over the years, that grew. Our nationwide staff grew to about 120 in our department within a much larger NBC News, about 100 of whom are based in North Carolina.
So you started off at a temporary location, but eventually you moved to a building adjacent to the NBC affiliate in Charlotte.
Yes, we started in a little warehouse literally over the railroad tracks, about 1,000 yards from the new location of the NBC affiliate, and we worked out of there for about 15 months while our new building was being constructed. And then we moved across the railroad tracks to our new building, and the news channel is still there.
How long did it take to hire 30 people and get them all moved to Charlotte for opening day? How fast did you ramp up?
I didn't have a lot of time. This got approved in the spring of 1990, and the bosses at NBC wanted the new operation to turn on and go on January 1st of 1991. And so I had to make the decisions that summer. Well, I didn't make the final decision. I had to make recommendations about the location by midsummer. Mr. Wright, to whom I'm eternally indebted, made a quick decision about where it ought to go. And once I knew that, I could start to hire people, because I couldn't hire anyone without telling them what city they would go to. So I started to gather some folks loaned to me by NBC News on a temporary basis to help me with certain technical and financial and logistical things. And then I started a series of hiring meetings and recruiting around the country. And I called people I knew. People heard what we were doing. Basically the HR department at NBC sent me stacks of resumes. And I started to, I sat at my kitchen table at home, because I didn't yet have an office, and on a 8.5 by 11 yellow legal pad, started working out the initial organizational structure. And I knew which positions I wanted to exist. And based on my prior news experience, I tried to figure out roughly how many of each of these positions I would need. I worked a lot on shifts, like how many during the day, how many at night. I knew it was a premise of my suggestion that it would be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I knew that, but I had to figure out how to fill that out. And I came up with this theoretical structure, and armed with that, started going around the country, hiring people. I remember I went to St. Louis through various methods of friends of mine and contacts and industry sources. I was able to do a recruiting trip where I finally met in person with about 12 people I had selected for interviews from around the Midwest. So they would come there. And then I met in other cities. I met in Orlando to hire people. I met out in Salt Lake City to hire people from the West, and pulled together nominees, and then started hiring. And I moved to Charlotte from Atlanta on Labor Day of 1990. And then the News Channel staff, a few people showed up in the fall, but the first day that most of the new employees showed up was December 3rd, 1990, and we started operation on January 1st, 1991.
You had a key employee that you hired from one of the stations in Charlotte that's now running the News Channel.
Yes, Sharon Houston. Actually, Sharon, when I hired Sharon, Sharon was actually working for CBS News in Atlanta, but she had been, but she was a native of Charlotte, grown up in Charlotte, and she had been an employee of WBTV in Charlotte, which is a fine station, fine news operation, and had been a reporter there before becoming a producer for CBS News. And she had replaced me when I left the bureau managership for CBS News in Atlanta. And I called and asked if she would conceivably be interested in taking on this job. And after a lot of negotiations between both networks, CBS News kindly allowed her to leave the company, and she came and joined us. So she was there in the very early days and was obviously, a huge part of our success. Hard to overestimate the contribution she made. So, and she's a top-notch manager as well as a top-notch news person. And we had Janae Von Essen had, as part of her deal with NBC, was going to run the international news gathering side of the News Channel. And then we were able to find some other key people in the early days. A fellow named Ken Heiberger came to work with us, who was who had a wide background in television news, but was a brilliant person on the technical and operations side, and we were able to assemble a really. It's very interesting. Of all the sets of decisions I had to make in 27 years at the News Channel, I look back at it now, and I realize that the most important ones I made were the hiring decisions in the early days, because they were the decisions that enabled us to survive those first couple of tough years, enabled us to earn respect around the company and from our clients and in the industry, enabled us to recruit future really good people. And I don't know how it happened. I don't think I'm all that brilliant. I think there must have been a fair amount of blind luck and good fortune involved. But I have to say, I really nailed those early hires. In this sense, I got exactly the right managers, because not everybody could do this. That was pretty frightening. If you think about it, when I called you up and said, hey, I want to offer you this job, we did not yet have an office. And yes, we had the backing of NBC, but whether or not we could get this thing up and operating in about 100 days. I say that now, and nobody starts anything in 100 days now in the world of television news. I don't think NBC would attempt it now. But those were simpler times, but I needed entrepreneurial spirit. And there's some wonderful news people who don't have that. And I also needed people who would be really good to other people, who would be good to our clients and be good to our future staff. And there are a lot of great news people who, I'm sorry to say, don't meet those qualifications. The notion of customer service in the news business is not a common one. So I needed somebody who wasn't afraid of doing things on their own, could live in a corporate environment, but could be non-corporate. They had to treat it like they owned it, like it was their own business, that we were going to be personally proud of this, and that we had to find people who could be simultaneously positive to our internal staff and to our external clients, and who were kind of ready for anything. And I think anybody who's ever been in a business or organizational venture and started something, whether it's a department or a project or a company, they'll know there are only so many of those people. And I was lucky to find, maybe I'll round it off at the 10 senior people who are really going to make and break us, and also I got a wonderful staff of young folks. I had about a dozen positions that I had allocated to be people in their first job. And I got wonderful people in that first dozen jobs, a few of whom are now in senior management positions at the NBC News Channel, some of whom went on to other really good jobs in NBC News or in elsewhere in the industry. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we got the top, middle, and bottom rungs on the organizational ladder just right. And that covered the multitude of mistakes that I went on to make over the years as the boss, where I got something wrong, and there were no shortage of examples of that. It was the staff that would rescue us from that decision, and they were the kind of people who attracted other good people. And you could come to work at the News Channel, and what I would say is, you come to work here, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take care of all that junk. I probably used a less diplomatic word that I won't use here on this program, but all that bad stuff that you run into elsewhere in the world of television news, all the bureaucracy, all the crap, the screaming and yelling, the decisions made for stupid reasons, all that stuff. I'll worry about that. If you want to cover the news, this is the most uncomplicated place you can ever come. You just come here, I'll deal with that, and you get the news covered every day. And I can also tell you, the person sitting next to you is going to be a good human being. You're going to like working with him or her. Now, they may not be the same as you. We're going to have all sorts of people here, but they're going to be good people, and you're going to want to come into work every day. And there are a lot of television news operations where, if I'm being honest, that's not the case. So I figured that was my recruiting pitch. This is a blank slate. We can make it what we want it to be. That's what I want it to be. What do you say? And I meant it. And we got a lot of really good people in the early days, and that allowed us to grow over the years.
Let's talk about the many facets of the business. You had, of course, you were the president of NBC News Channel. Your wife, Janae Von Essen, she was in charge of international news, and it also became an income opportunity because as you serviced international clients, they paid a fee for that.
They did, and the company, NBC, wanted us to be able to pay our own way, so we became sort of an internal business. I actually had a bottom line responsibility, and we had to go out and raise money. A lot of that came from our international clients. Some of that came from technical operations that we offer to local stations, satellite transponders and that kind of thing. And over the years, it actually became, on an NBC scale, you consider it a small business, but it became a self-sustaining business.
So you had over 200 customers, which were NBC affiliates throughout the country. You had a number of international customers, typically, Japan and different places that had news operations, that your wife traveled all over the world in working with those clients and establishing those feeds. And her experience in the startup at CNN with managing international news just blended perfectly to be able to bring that experience and know-how to this operation.
She made a contribution on what it's like to be in a startup and how you organize a startup, and then she obviously had the understanding of international news organizations, and they're very complex and not like each other, by the way. The fact that you know how they do it in Brazil doesn't mean you know how they do it in Japan. And so knowing all that and being able to help navigate us through those waters in the early days was also critical.
You also negotiated contracts on behalf of affiliates for specific news services. For instance, you negotiated a contract for sports services, which was something that was completely off your radar, but you still needed that information and that expertise, and you dealt with some independent contractors and established some feeds and video information that was kind of unique in the industry.
It was. We had a unique charter with the NBC affiliates. It was different than the relationships with that ABC, CBS, et cetera, had with their stations. And we actually gave, and this was considered quite controversial when I recommended it, but NBC, to its credit, let me do it, and that is that we gave the 200 NBC affiliates around the country some actual management say in the operation of the news channel. The news channel was wholly owned by NBC, but they had some governance rights, to use the legal term, and we took their views seriously. And because that was the foundation, they would then commission us to say, oh, we are comfortable if you go out and negotiate for sports video highlights on behalf of all of us. I don't think, if we had not had that cooperative legal foundation that gave them true participation in the management of the news channel, I don't believe they would have been comfortable in letting us, in certain cases, negotiate for them with third parties.
How unusual is it for a network news gathering operation like this to be located in a state like North Carolina? Can you think of any other example?
Well, I would certainly say in the world of cable news, our friends at CNN certainly did, I think, a wonderful job of making Atlanta work for them. And then it's unusual enough to say that we started it officially on January 1st of 1991. And in terms of this kind of operation actually having its headquarters someplace besides New York and or Washington, it's still the only one. So I would say it's unique.
Very unique. And gosh, how many employees in Charlotte?
Right now, I think I've retired and no longer. I'm happy to say, and no longer have the statistics necessarily perfectly up to date, but I would say probably right at 100 in Charlotte and another 20 or so at other cities around the country. But those are just the permanent staff. Counting freelancers and people who help in other ways in the different cities, I would think that the news channel probably involves the efforts of about 140 individuals over the course of a typical 7-day week. But that's just the people working on the processing. The secret of the news channel is it actually connects the hundreds of people who work for local stations and the hundreds of people who work for international clients, who all become part of this system that works for everybody, not just the NBC staff employees, but all the other folks. And because it works for everybody, everybody is willing to contribute to it and to cooperate with it. And there are days where it sort of doesn't make any difference who you're working for, like who's writing your paycheck. Making that system work is at least a little bit of the part of everybody's day. And that's why I think it's the model. It certainly required tweaking, adjustments for technology, but I think that's why the model still basically works. It multiplies the work product of all these individual people and organizations. Let's
talk about one other thing that you did that I don't think most people know was a product of North Carolina. And NBC News Channel was the production arm for all of the NBC Olympic Games.
Well, we certainly the good people at NBC Sports and or Olympics actually did the production of the actual telecast that people saw at home, but the news coverage associated with the Olympics, particularly the news coverage seen on local television stations around the country, we were in charge of that. So we would go to Torino, Italy, and set up these big operations. There would be a core of news channel staffers there to make it work, but then local stations from around the country could send their own personnel there, join our team, if you will. They could concentrate on the athletes from their hometown. We would do stories designed to work all over the United States, and it was sort of an alliance that would come together for the Olympics Games. Everybody would go home, and then 2 years later we would reassemble, and so we sent people. The first the first Olympics after we started was Barcelona in 1992. We sent about 6 people to that, and I think that Rio de Janeiro in the summer of 2016. I think that newsroom, news channel staff plus local stations was about 150.
So, and that process, while it was every 2 years, began almost the day after the prior Olympics ended. The planning, it wasn't just a drop-in. It took a lot of planning, a lot of visits to make sure everything was in place so that it worked seamlessly once the games began.
Oh, it's incredibly hard. You're right. You're competing, the folks back home, and you're watching the Olympics, on which NBC does such a wonderful job. You don't understand that in order to do that, NBC has basically had to fight for scarce resources with a lot of other major international broadcasters from around the world, and then within that context, NBC News and NBC News Channel have to really get in there and push for all the resources that we need to make something work. So when the Olympics ended in Rio, I guess that was August of 2016, and then there was obviously the general election in the United States, first Tuesday of that November, and I think it was the next week, the week after the election, that personnel from NBC News and the News Channel flew to Korea to start working on
Start
the
the
next
process.
Olympics. So it's
people don't understand
It
how
never
much.
it never quits.
Yeah.
But you're excited to do it. It's a positive event. People in the U.S. Love that event, and it was different from what we frequently had to do. Earthquakes and disasters and terrorist attacks and all sorts of craziness in Washington, D.C., and all the other things we had to do. It was, for our staff, it was news coverage, but it was a different kind and seen in a different context. And I always had more, I'll put it this way, we always had many more volunteers to go than we could accommodate. People on the News Channel staff always wanted to do it, and I have to say they did an outstanding job of it.
So 200 customers locally, United States, many, many international customers, news coverage of the Olympics in a manner in which no one else did it. Quite an operation in North Carolina.
Well, I retired in the summer of 2017, and I have had a little bit of time now. I could look back with a little more clarity, a little more perspective. I tried to have perspective when I was there, but you're right in the thick of the battle every day. And I did step back and try to analyze things from time to time, but it was so intense just to get through the day. That was hard. But now I think back on it, and I think that I think I made promises. I made promises to NBC that it would have the best relationship with its affiliate body in the industry if they would give me a chance, and that promise came true. I promised the NBC affiliates that if they would give us a chance, cooperate with us, support us, not look backwards at the relationship, but look at what the relationship could be, I promised them that they would end up with an entity that really supported their critical local news, most important thing local stations do, and that we could help them in ways they had never seen before. And that promise came true. And I promised the employees that if they would come with us and work these incredible hours and take these career risks and do these very difficult things, that we would make it a place they wanted to stay, and they would be treated right, and we kept that promise. So I think that I got a lot of things wrong. I think I got those things right, and that saved us. And there are things that I regret, just mistakes I made along the way. Did I see a certain technological opportunity as quickly as I might have, or did I make the right decision the right way to cover that news story or the right way to handle the budget. And there have been things that, as I've been honest with myself and look back, I've said, I could have done that differently. I might have done that differently. But the one thing that I have never doubted myself on is I was right to put it in North Carolina. It turned out to be a wonderful home for us. It's a great state. It's a diverse state. It's a state that's really like a lot of the rest of the country. When we would talk to NBC News in New York, one of our senior people was the daily liaison with them on certain calls, and he would basically say, well, whatever you just said is very interesting. Let me tell you how it looks out here in America. And we would help them get a wider perspective than I think they might otherwise have gotten clustered together in Manhattan. And I think that has been valuable. And so whatever I would do over differently, I wouldn't change a thing about the decision to put that organization in North Carolina. I'm glad I did it and would do it again.
Bob Horner, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
27 years as the president of NBC News Channel.
And still get around without anybody to help me. So I'm still able to walk and talk on my own. So
Thank you.
okay.